And welcome back to WCCF Tech TV, everyone. This is Keith again today, and we finally finished all of the notes and all of the tests and everything to get this finished up. This is our review of the Ryzen 7 1800X, and hopefully we can bring some things into focus. So as we go through this review, it's going to be a bit longer than normal. There's going to be a lot of discussion, there's going to be a lot of graphs, and there's going to be a whole lot of, hopefully, some understanding that we all come to, even though there's already, well, everybody's pretty much published their reviews at this point. Ours, as you guys know, didn't show up until the day the embargo lifted, so that was about the time we got started on this review. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the Ryzen 7 1800X and just what it is. The 1800X is the top-end flagship CPU launched in the Ryzen 7 with the initial launching of the new AM4 platform. Now, this is their fastest, highest core count CPU that they have available. We're talking 8 cores, 16 threads with 16 megs of cache at an amazing 95 watt TDP, which is quite impressive for this. Now, one of the big things here is we mentioned threading. The 1800X, as well as the rest of the Ryzen family, features simultaneous multi-threading. No, this is not what they call hyper-threading. Hyper-threading is what Intel calls SMT. So I see that go around a lot. Just thought we'd clear that one up. So AMD hasn't changed it, naming it anything crazy. It's just simultaneous multi-threading that allows one core to parallelize and act as 2 threads when a task is given that can take advantage of simultaneous multi-threading. Otherwise, the workload transitions to the primary core and leaves the SMT pretty much unused. So another thing I want to mention is XFR, which is extended frequency range, utilizing through the SenseMi technology with the 25 megahertz increments that the CPU is able to clock and fluctuate throughout. XFR allows it to go to 4.1 gigahertz when utilizing a single thread. So luckily we did see that in action. One of the most interesting things with the design of the Ryzen CPU family, and this goes all the way down to the quad cores as we've seen, is their utilization of CCX modules. Now their CCX modules break up into multiple chunks, but each module consists of 4 cores and 8 threads. So all of their CPUs feature simultaneous multi-threading, so you're looking at quad-core chunks. What's interesting is the 1600X and the 1500X, so the 1600 and the 1400 respectively, have cores disabled on each CCX. They both feature both CCX modules. So you got a 2+2 design and a 6+6 or 3+3 design, resulting in a quad core and a 6-core part. These two parts, these two CCX modules, are connected across what they're referring to as the Infinity Fabric that allows them to communicate with one another. And it's been found that when something's access, especially memory controllers, across both of the CCX modules, that causes a spike in latency. And this is a really low level, almost imperceptible latency. You really have to measure it using things that we do not have here. So we're not able to test that on our end. However, the guys over at PC Perspective did a pretty good job analyzing that. So I advise you to go check out their story on that. We should shed some light into that particular issue. Let's talk about the motherboard that we used for this review. We used the MSI X370 X Power Gaming Titanium. That is a huge mouthful of a motherboard. It is the most expensive X370 motherboard that you can get, coming in at $299 US. Now, part of the reason this review was delayed was because of that motherboard. We actually went through 4 different EFIs. The initial EFI that shipped on the motherboard would not allow us to boot at anything past 2133 megahertz RAM. So we immediately went to the website and downloaded version 1.1, which is publicly available, and we were then able to get up to 2400 megahertz. And seeing as how that Infinity Fabric, or the communication between CCXs, benefits from greater speed memory, and the competing platforms that we really compared this to, being X99 and Z270, were capable of much faster memories without any issue, our goal was to increase the memory to, well, as far as we could get it on the X370 platform, to not necessarily give the CPU every ounce that it could, but rather see just what was capable with it given enough memory speed. So we moved up to 1.22 and were able to boot in one time just once at DDR4 2993. So right at the XMP settings for the DDR, well, the 16 gig kit of DDR 3000, and it only did it one time. After that, it just wouldn't boot back in. So 2667 CL15 is what we ended up with. Now that going forward into the reviews, we did have the high precision event timer disabled on everything except for when we tested the HWBot X265 encoding, because it actually requires it and it will not run without that enabled. So keep that in mind when we get to those numbers. Now, we did have it set to high performance mode and not balance mode for all of the tests per the request by AMD. So that high performance mode was set in every CPU. So when we did the X99 and the Z270, they were set to high performance mode. Even the 970 chipset for the AM3 Plus platform that we tested. And something to keep in mind, and we'll get to that. Well, I'll hold off that till we get to the test platforms. So now that we've got the motherboard and everything that we used, the setup for the 1800X was the 1800X obviously running at stock settings. Along with the memory issue on the motherboard, as we got things settled in with the EFI, we also were able to finally see XFR boosting. With the first two BIOSes, we never saw it boost to the 4.1. However, once we got to 1.22, we did start seeing the boosting in a single core workload, which did help with things like Cinebench, and it helped a little bit in gaming, but only if the game called for a single core. Another thing that we had to keep in mind was the temperatures seemed excessively high for the CPU, since we had it on a Cooler Master Liquid 120 AIO. I know it's only a single all-in-one cooler, but the temperatures were reading, even under full load, upwards to over 70 degrees Celsius. But luckily we found out that the motherboards and the CPUs are sending out a signal to read at a plus 20 degrees Celsius offset to enable a more aggressive fan curve for things like these XFR ratings, as well as keeping the chip even cooler, which I get it, but at the same time, it causes your fan curves to go crazy. Ours constantly was ramping up and ramping down, even at idle, just from fluctuations. So something to keep in mind there. Now, the full test setup that we used for the X370 was, of course, the 1800X at stock. And we used the MSI X370 X-Power Gaming Titanium motherboard with EFI version 1.22. The memory was set to was 32 gigs by a 4x8 gig kit of Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 set to 2667 with CL15. We did have the high precision event timer disabled, except for an HWBot encoding test, and the high performance mode was set in all of these scenarios on all versions of Windows. Now the platforms that we were testing against was the X99 using the i7 6800K at stock, on the Asus X99A2 motherboard with the same 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 RAM. Our Z270 platform carried the i7 7700K at stock with the Z270 Maximus 9 Hero using the same memory yet again at this same speed. Now, both of these motherboards, we did leave the multi-core enhancement turned on, and somebody out there is going to question why we did that. And the truth is, if we're going to put the Ryzen setup in high performance mode as well as everything else, I don't know anybody who's ever gone in their BIOS and said, let me disable multi-core enhancement, because more motherboards have it than don't. It's just part of the platform. So those were enabled through that. We did do the AM3 Plus. We threw that in there for just curiosity. We did do a previous video where we only compared the initial 1800X results directly to the 8350. Once I waited to get everything set up to revise the numbers and go forward and get everything for these comparisons. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about our CPU benchmarks. So these are the CPU benchmarks on the aforementioned setups that we used. Now, we're going to kick things off looking at 3D Mark Time Spy, and we specifically are looking at the CPU test, or the physics if you'd rather. Now, the physics test shows a huge win for the Ryzen 1800X thanks to its cores and threads, beating out the 6800K, which only slightly edged out the 7700K, and all of them completely wiped the floor of the 8350, showing its clear deficit, especially when it's come to its age. So it's good to see that benchmarks such as TimeSpy are taking good advantage of the threading and the cores that are available on the 1800X. But what does that mean when we move into Cinebench? So Cinebench shows a very interesting mixed bag here. Of course, the multi-core is eons ahead of everything else. I mean, we're talking way out in the lead here. So 1608 is what we got for the 1800X, followed in a distant second by the 6800K at 1102, and the 7700K at 965 and 654 respectively for the 8350. Now what's interesting here is at the stock clocks, the 1800X, thanks to the XFR boosting, was able to achieve a higher single core performance on Cinebench R15 than the 6800K. However, it was quite a bit behind the 7700K, has a clear win on that. So, and of course all of them beat out the 8350 substantially. So that's something really interesting to keep in mind here. Now, moving on to a test like SuperPi, which is something in the past that AMD has struggled immensely in and watched Intel slowly and, well, methodically pull further ahead and become much faster than. This is a single core threaded test, and it shows the the capabilities of the 1800X slightly behind the 6800K and a good bit behind the 7700K, but a clear 20, just over between a 19 and 20 second advantage over the 8350, showing huge gains from their last high-end desktop CPU release. Now moving into the HWBot X265 encoding test, this is the one that I said the high precision event timer was enabled for because it had to be enabled from this. 1080p, the 1800X renders out at right at a smooth 30 FPS, while the 8350 is less than half of that, and the 6800K loses out to the 7700K thanks to the clock speed advantage that the 7700K has. However, when you move things up into the 4K region, you see the 1800X maintains its lead, the 6800K pulling in behind it and now taking the advantage over the 7700K. And we'll just leave the 8350 over there to the side. Now moving into something like Geekbench 4. So we used Geekbench 4 so we could use the 64-bit test rather than the 32-bit that we get with the Geekbench 3. Shows the single core performance slightly edged out of the 6800K as expected thanks to XFR, but pulling a fair bit behind the 7700K, but yet again way ahead of the 8350. Now the multi-core is quite interesting here on this one. I'm not sure quite what's going on because it barely edged out the 6800K and was quite a bit ahead of the 7700K multi-core. But the interesting thing here is it's only twice as fast in the multi-core as the 8350. And you say, why? Well, Keith, why is that interesting? Well, I would expect it to be more than twice as fast because it has twice the threading and the speed of the CPU is a lot faster. So that's an interesting one. And of course, we had to run the Blender test. This is the one that AMD made famous that is available on their website, where you render out the Ryzen CPU die in real time using 150 samples, what have you, and they were all tested at the same settings, and it shows a clear advantage thanks to the cores and threads of the 1800X coming in significantly faster than anything else in this test. So taking a look at all of these CPU specific performance numbers, we can see that the 1800X is a powerhouse when it comes to productivity as well as rendering workloads. So if this is something you're in the market for and you need these cores and threads, you really are getting quite the value here because this processor is only a little bit more expensive than the 6800K, but this particular 1800X carries a $150 premium over the 7700K and quite a bit over the 8350, but you can see here that it's going to substantially make up for itself. Now moving into power consumptions, these are the most interesting numbers out of anything. Even when we go into the gaming, all of the CPU tests, everything, the power draw figures are absolutely impressive because the running joke has always been, if you're running AMD, get ready to invest in more utilities because it's going to bring up your utility bill substantially. Well, I'm here to report that this 1800X pulling 8 cores, 16 threads, Now for this test we did run, these power draw numbers were taken while running Blender, so everything's full out, flat out, full speed, and specifically loaded in the CPU. You're seeing the power draw only slightly edge out the 7700K as far as pulling 178 watts over 176 watts with 7700K. But if you back up and look at those time differences, it's huge. Even the 6800K is pulling 210 watts. Now, granted, the 6800K is also pulling quad channel memory, whereas we're pulling dual channel with the 1800X. And if you look over at the 8350 and see that it's pulling 200 watts and the Ryzen 1800X is pulling 22 less watts and 3 times faster at Blender. So, a 3x reduction in time that it takes to render that out. And idle power draws are around, 49 watts at idle. It's only slightly more than the 7700K, even less than the 6800K, and way less than the 8350. That's absolutely impressive. It doesn't really matter how you slice that. That's a very impressive number, and that's something that that uses my system for productivity more than gaming. I like these numbers. These make me very happy. So that's been the CPU test specifically. Let's move on into gaming and see how this thing fares as gaming, because I'm sure you all are quite interested in seeing that, and it seems to have been the talk of the town. So let's move into that. So here we are to talk about the gaming performance of Ryzen 7 1800X, and it's probably the biggest Achilles heel of the platform. And we'll talk a little bit more about alternatives and what I think is something you should look at if you're looking at this platform for gaming. So we're going to start things off with Watch Dogs 2. Now, all of these tests are run at 1080p, and I will discuss the settings used as we go there. And yes, we're using 1080p because while it's a very common resolution, it's a resolution that will exhibit the differences in the CPU performance. 720p and 480p testing is absolutely ridiculous because nobody's gaming at those resolutions, whereas 1080p, even people who are using it for productivity purposes, a lot of people are still gaming at those resolutions. So if you want to see other resolutions, let us know in the comments below. We'll address those in a separate video. We'll be more than happy to. Now, for all of these game tests, we used the reference or Founders Edition GTX 1080 and left it at auto fan curve, let it run its thing to come up with these results. So jumping into Watch Dogs 2, the Ryzen 7 1800X actually does decently well here. Perhaps the run that we use to test our benchmarks is a bit more intensive on the CPUs as far as cores and threads go, because our 7700K fell behind our 1800X in this one, even on the 1%, 0.1% lows. Now our 6800K was the real winner here, scoring quite a bit faster in this game than anything else. So there's some optimization left to be had here. I would assume, everybody throws around the optimization word, but truth is, these cores were loaded up, the game was loaded up, everything ran smooth, but this is consistently got these results. Moving into Ashes of the Singularity, I was expecting to see quite a bit of difference here, quite a bit of advantage for the 1800X, as most people were, but yet again, it kind of fell short on this one. We're looking at 34 average with the 20 and 30 on the lows, whereas the 6800K came out quite a bit ahead and the 7700K edged it out. However, seeing the advantage over the 8350, that is nice to see. And that was with the in-game benchmark set to high, as well as in the CPU portion of the test. So it's testing the CPU more than the graphics cards. So if you were curious and want to run that yourself. Now, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, we ran it at 1080p with the high preset in DX12. To back things up, the Ashes of the Singularity was also running DX12. So back to Deus Ex Mankind Divided, we see the 1800X edge out the 7700K here, but still fall quite a bit behind the 6800K in this particular game, and still edge out the 8350 by quite a bit. Okay, so going into Dirt Rally, we see a huge improvement over the old architecture. However, the 1800X falls behind the 6800K and the 7700K when it comes to this game, because this game does utilize threading. However, it uses it relies quite a bit more on that single core performance, showing a huge delta between the 1800X and the 7700K. So that's now look, let's just be perfectly honest. The difference between 140 to 171, I don't know that you're really going to see that. Something real interesting to point out here is that the minimums are better on the 1800X than they were on the 7700K. So it does feel a bit smoother because of that. That's something I want to make sure everybody's paying attention to as we're going through these numbers. Now moving into Doom with the game set to Ultra using the anti-aliasing that keeps Vulkan enabled, we see the 1800X slightly edge out the i7 7700K. Now that's in averages, minimums, the 1%, 0.1% lows, and I'm so sure somebody out there is confused, but Keith, I've seen other places where it's much higher. Well, something to keep in mind here when it comes to Doom is it does have a 200 FPS cap, and that will affect these numbers somewhat at 1080p. Something else to keep in mind is games are tested in different areas. My test is a bit longer. The first part of the test, everything's pegged at 200, but once I go through a door and go out into an open area, the CPU utilization goes through the roof, which is a good thing for a test like this because it shows what happens when it goes under heavy CPU load. So these are the results that we got. We've seen the 1800X slightly edge out the 7700K. Now into our last game, which is Total War Warhammer, and this is a title that we're being told is going to be updated to better utilize Ryzen chips. But however, this is kind of where it stands today. It is, throwing the 8350 out the window, it is the worst performing of the three modern CPUs. The 7700K is an absolute runaway with this one in every aspect, from averages all the way down to the bottom, and the 1800X is quite a bit behind in everything on this game. So it's not exactly going to be the Total War CPU if that's kind of your game. Now, something interesting to keep in mind here is background tasks will really affect this game. So that's going to kind of wrap it up with our gaming test. I know it's not a huge amount of games. We only tested 6 different games, but we felt that they provided a good round image of the performance of the CPU. And there are also all games that do tend to favor higher thread count CPUs, and hopefully that will give you kind of it's actually pretty good case scenario for the 1800X, and it's got a ways to come yet in gaming, so that's definitely apparent. But let's move past gaming and let's discuss some Windows 7. So Windows 7, there's a lot of talk about people utilizing Windows 7 to get even better performance out of the 1800X. So we did spend a day and got an install of Windows 7 working on it, and I ran a few different tests. Now the biggest ones to keep mind of here that we ran were Cinebench as well as 3D Mark Firestrike. And Firestrike, the reason I ran that is because even though we didn't include it in the first portion of the test, was in Windows 10 we saw an abnormally low combined score for what the CPU is capable of. The physics score was great, but the combined score it just didn't seem right. It didn't fit. And the weird thing was in Windows 7 with the Firestrike combined score, we actually saw a 36% increase in performance. And digging around a little bit, and a lot of what we can attribute the differences in Windows 7 and Windows 10 and performance-wise is Windows 7 is doing what allegedly a lot of people considered Windows 10 to be doing with the scheduler issue and not being able to identify between cores and threads. And again, the guys over at PCPer did a pretty good job showing that Windows 10 does see cores and threads. And even AMD admitted that, yes, it's working perfectly fine. However, Windows 10 seems to identify the 1800X as a 16-core, 16-thread CPU. So it will pin applications to a core or a thread. It'll alternate, but it thinks it's cores. Now, a 36% increase in the combined score is huge. I mean, it took our average with the 1080, the average system score, from just over 18,000 to over 20,000. So that overall score. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. And with the whole debacle on Microsoft blocking updates for Ryzen CPUs as well as Kaby Lake, I just couldn't imagine at this point buying a processor like this and going to Windows 7 as your primary operating system, but I could be wrong, and maybe there's some people out there that just have no interest in moving off. And to those people, I really recommend, well, just sticking with an older platform and going with a high core count, multi-threaded Haswell Xeon part or something along those lines. But that was kind of our result in Windows 7 that we saw. It was interesting, but it didn't really warrant extended testing because I didn't see the relevance in going forward outside of just a few tests. Moving past that, let's talk about disabling SMT and disabling cores to get an idea of what to expect from 6 and quad core parts for Ryzen. Now, we did disable SMT for a few things, but let's be perfectly honest, who spends $800 or $500 on a processor just to disable a core feature of it? So SMT disabling, it had some effect in some games and some it didn't. It just, for the most part, it was kind of pointless to disable it unless you're just somebody who doesn't think Windows or your games can handle the threading and you only want 8 cores without the extra threads. So that's going to be a personal basis kind of thing. I'm not running a whole bunch of tests, and going forward when we test games on Ryzen, we're not going to be running multiple tests where we disable SMT just to see what it does. We're going to leave it on. It's a core function of it. It's just like why I don't want to disable XFR unless I'm overclocking, so it's not even an option in the BIOS. Moving on to that, to disabling cores, so a 3+3 and a 2+2 design. The interesting thing about the 6-core 12-thread part is in all of our testing, and we're not going to publish these numbers because we never got approval to publish them, but I think the real winner out of all of the Ryzen setups is going to be the Ryzen 5 1600X if you're a gamer. The problem with the 1800X, after talking to other reviewers as well as people who have bought these parts, is you can get similar performance from an Ryzen 7 1700 and a B350 board with a healthy overclock. A friend of mine has a 1700 and an MSI Tomahawk B350, and we're getting practically the exact same numbers after he tweaked on his for just a fair bit. So that's the biggest problem with the 1800X is I can only recommend it is if you want the highest end part. It's the same reason back in the day I never recommended a 9590. It had nothing to do with the TDP. It had everything to do with the fact that you could get essentially the same performance out of a part like the 8350 for substantially less money. And then you could get it to where you wanted to and you had a little fun with the overclocking. So the 1800X is a hard sell because of its price at $499 when compared to products in its own stack. Compared to the Intel counterparts for productivity, it absolutely stomps the competition. Gaming leaves a bit to be desired, but then again, it's competing with itself with the upcoming Ryzen 5 1600X, having 2 less cores and 4 less threads, and still that's kind of where we stand on the Ryzen 1800X. It was a bit longer of a video than we normally do, but I wanted to go through all of these parts and make sure that I give you guys the best coverage that I could on it and give you the most accurate representation of my usage, because I have been using this chip since the day it showed up. So it did replace my 7700K in my personal setup that I use for editing and workstation flow, but our 6800K will remain as our primary test system for gaming and graphics cards. I will utilize the Ryzen chip just to give you guys an idea of how it performs. If we get more Ryzen chips in the future, we will be doing a review on those and comparing to them, but I really, really feel like on April 11th, when the Ryzen 5 1600X launches, Ryzen 7 is a great chip. It's a great power draw, excellent performance when it comes to multi-threading and when it comes to production activities and production workloads. It's made my life easier when it comes to rendering. In fact, I render a video out and I load up Wildlands and go right back to playing while it's rendering, and it still renders just as fast, if not faster, than either the 6800K or the 7700K in Sony Vegas. So I'm going to leave you with that. The 1800X shows that there is a lot of promise and a lot of potential in the AM4 platform. The particular chip of the 1800X, however, is a bit of a hard sell. So if you have any questions about this, if I left something out or I didn't clarify something, feel free to ask in the comments. We'll try our best to catch anything that we may have missed. And I do apologize again for the video being a bit longer, but this has been Keith with WCCF Tech TV, and we will catch you in the next video.